oil is dead. And for people in the sector, it's very important that there be just transition funds, that there be strategies that go to every worker, every community.
Oil is dead. That's the Green Party, the former leader, now the parliamentary leader. Earlier today, her declaration that oil is dead was then echoed by the Bloc Québécois leader, Yves-François Blanchet, who said oil is, quote, never coming back. Then he said, putting any more money in that business is a very bad idea. This is the oil and gas sector demands some aid. It employs more than 500,000 Canadians. It generates more than $8 billion of revenue for the federal government every year. And that was before the price collapse. And it was worth close to about 11% of Canada's GDP. Did these two people just write off an entire industry in hopes of a transition to alternative energy in the midst of a crisis where people are literally losing their jobs? Will this create division? The press gallery is going to weigh in on that. CTV's Molly Thomas joins us, and our special guest is not only the NDP, former NDP leader, and now CTV political analyst Tom Mulcair, also the woman behind the words, the Green Party parliamentary leader Elizabeth May. Great to have all of you here. Elizabeth May, these words have really been provocative, controversial. You've got unemployment in the highest rate in the country is in Calgary, and you've got almost every study that I've looked at, the International Energy Association, they say for at least 20 years, oil and gas will play a significant, up to 64, 65% of our energy needs. You declare oil is dead in a crisis. How do you justify that?
I'm also reading the international reports, Evan, and the International Energy Agency said last week that oil, coal, and gas, in other words, all fossil fuels, are declining in demand. The only sector in terms of energy that's doing well in the pandemic is renewables. And the International Energy Agency said this could be a multi-decade drop in demand. And 2 days ago, Royal Dutch Shell said they really doubt that it's going to come back. So when we're looking, I'm not declaring something as a policy prescription. I'm looking at the reality. The drop in demand looks
sorry. Like I have to just, with all due respect, Elizabeth May, I've read those reports too. Not one of them said oil is dead. That was your words. I read, they said some of them are declining because of COVID. The demand curve over the next 20 years may be lessened, but not one of those reports says that over the next 20 years, oil and gas will not play a major role. And it was your words that said oil is dead.
Yeah, I don't.
That's a very provocative term.
Excuse me. Well, excuse me for 1 minute, Evan. It's obvious that we're in a major technological transition. There are disruptive technologies here, and in the same way that kerosene displaced whale oil for lamps, fossil fuels are being displaced by disruptive technologies. It doesn't take a lot to see that where government should put its in, and I'll mention one other report, which I hope you've looked at, which is the report that came out of Oxford University this week by Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz and former Chancellor of the Exchequer from the UK, Sir Nicholas Stern, a very prominent economist, and they're both saying it would be a mistake to put money after the pandemic to stimulate the economy in oil and gas. The place to put money post-COVID-19 to stimulate the economy is where it can get some traction. You don't want to pour water on sand. You want to put something, and in terms of public resources, in technologies that will create the jobs. I don't say for 1 minute that we're not going to be putting gas in our cars next year and the year after, and we should use Canadian oil as long as we're using oil. But it is not it's not a reasonable prospect. In fact, it's rather delusional to imagine that we're going to see the sector come roaring back.
But Elizabeth May, it sounds to me like you're giving a eulogy when the body is very much alive here. And I know you're quoting Mr. Stern and Mr. Stiglitz, two economists. There's 533,000 workers. There's people in Calgary that will say, I don't know those guys, but I'll tell you what, I got to put bread on my table. I've lost my job. And Elizabeth May has just declared my industry dead, and it's very much not dead before COVID-19. How do you look those Canadians in the face and say, how do they pay their mortgage? How do they feed their family?
I don't know if you listened to all of what I said. It even was included in the clip you used. It's imperative that the workers and the communities, and of course oil isn't going to shut down overnight, but the idea that there's a long-term prospect, particularly for expensive oil such as bitumen. We know that what the Saudis and the Russians did in bringing the price of oil down to historic lows, combined with the unprecedented decline in demand from COVID-19 globally, it creates a situation that is unprecedented. And it will require that we get as much funding as we can to the Alberta economy for diversification. There will certainly be oil produced, there'll be bitumen produced. It can go to petrochemical products, but there isn't a market for bitumen, not now and not for a long time.
Tom Mulcair, what do you make of what not only Elizabeth May is saying, but Mr. Blanchet is saying, do not give any aid package to the oil and gas sector?
Well, that would just be consistent with a promise that Mr. Trudeau's made for some time, but he hasn't kept. It was one of the big broken promises of his 2015-2019 mandate. He did indeed continue to subsidize the oil and gas sector. There's a lot of pushback right now. Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers just a couple of weeks ago saying, can we get rid of all lobbying rules so we can do whatever we want? Oh, and by the way, can we start dismantling environmental rules? We don't have enough environmental rules in Canada, but they're trying to get rid of the few that are left. So this is the big debate that's going to take place. But on the subject of COVID-19, not only are people seeing a night sky that they haven't seen in decades, not only are people in some parts of the world getting to see mountain ranges that they haven't seen in decades, but people are realizing that one sector, to name it, transportation, which is comprised in large part by people commuting constantly, we don't have to commute like that. People are learning to do what we're doing right now. And so the fact of the matter is, it is going to be a different world. I agree with Elizabeth that demand is going to decrease. And to the extent that that industry, it will continue, by the way, for decades. That's why it's not useless to some of the work that's being done right now in that sector. But what's the most important thing to note is that market forces are determining where the money is going. Big investment firms like BlackRock, big investors are looking at big projects here in Canada and saying, we're not touching this stuff anymore. That's the big change right now. It is a market-driven thing, and people are moving away from it because the central thesis that Elizabeth May is putting forward, that the industry is at a tipping point. It is time to start looking at other ways of producing electricity in particular, and she's right.
Okay, although, the price of seeing some mountain ranges in some cities is that the economy has collapsed. And I think there's a lot of people out there saying that's an expensive view that we're getting right now. But Molly, let me go to you. Politicians I understand there's a long transition. I don't even think no one in the oil industry doubts that there's a long energy transition. The question is, should they give aid to the oil and gas industry now? What do you make of how this controversy's played out, Molly?
Well, with all due respect, Miss May, I think saying oil is dead is like telling Michael Jordan after 3 straight championships that he needs to quit, right? This is an economic sector in our country that has driven our country 10% of the country's GDP. It is our largest export worldwide. And unless we're going to stop planes, trains, and automobiles indefinitely, not just for a short period of time, indefinitely, this is not the last dance for oil. And so you also have to look at the BRICS and the emerging countries around the world. China's opening back up. India and Brazil, when they start moving where the largest points of our population are around the world, as long as those countries still need oil, someone has to supply them. And Canada can either be a part of that game. I agree, Mr. Mulcair, Ms. May, that we have to change into the renewable energy game long term, but that's not going to happen overnight. In the meantime, Canada can either be a part of that, making money, making sure that our country is using the sectors that we have, or we're going to get steamrolled by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia.
Let me go last word to you, Elizabeth May. Look, and I appreciate the long transition, and I'm not surprised, of course, that you're talking about it, but I'm just talking about the crisis right now. The Prime Minister is faced with people who are being absolutely brutalized by the collapse of the oil price and then COVID-19. Would you agree with Mr. Blanchet that in that case, they should not give any money to that industry? I know you're talking about a transition, but this is urgent right now. No aid money to that industry?
That industry is getting aid money. They're getting the same as any other corporation that fits the bill. They get 75% of wages can be subsidized. They're having access to loans at very preferential terms, and they got $1.9 billion towards cleaning up abandoned and orphaned wells, which normally would be the job of the industry itself to clean up after itself. And we support that because it gets people to work. We could also be looking at what can we do right now to ensure that the Alberta economy diversifies. They have a tremendous potential for solar energy, better than any other province in Canada. They have tremendous potential as well in wind energy. More wind power is being installed right now in Alberta than any other province in Canada. I would never turn our back on our neighbors and our friends in Alberta, ever. But to think that, and this is a question of the economics post pandemic, it will be a dangerous move for the economy to put public money behind bankrolling and bailing out oil and gas. It will be the wrong play to bring our economy back. And we can look in the rearview mirror all we want at what was there before the pandemic, before Saudi and Russian price manipulation, before we signed the Paris Agreement and realized with every ton of carbon into the atmosphere, we're farther from our kids having a livable world. Things have changed.